So we've sat through hundreds of OKR performance meetings, and I've noticed that sometimes the participants get off base because of what's being termed cognitive biases. And so what I'd like to do here is outline the most common cognitive biases we see in performance meetings. So these are meetings not when you're building the OKRs, but rather when you're using them, those weekly, monthly performance meetings where you've got a cross-functional team talking about operational issues. Now, this is where we're going to build out eventually, but I'm going to go through each of these biases one at a time because they do warrant a bit of an explanation. So, starting the top left, bias number one is, and these are in no particular sequence, fundamental attribution error, which is where when you take a look at an objective, if you see someone else's not hitting the objective, you think it's due to their work, but you have a problem, it's only caused by the situation. So the example would be, you, other person, didn't achieve because your team didn't work well with others. Whereas I didn't achieve my objective because the economy tanked. Bias number two, again, in no particular sequence, self-serving bias, which is basically the opposite of the first one. My successes are because of things I've done, they're my responsibility, but our failures are situational. What's that look like? Well, I achieved my objective ABC because we all worked hard. The other side of that coin is we did not achieve our objective because of COVID, some situational pressure. Groupthink, where we end up making crazy decisions in order to conform. So an example there might be, we did not achieve our objective this month. What we'll do is we'll change its target rather than fault finding and trying to solve root cause of why we didn't achieve it. So in that case, it's a crazy idea, right? If you didn't achieve your goal, you should really do some problem solving to figure out what the root cause is rather than just, masking the issue by changing your key result. False consensus, where we think when we say something that more people are in agreement with us than actually are. So what that would look like is, everyone agrees that this poor performance is acceptable. Well, maybe they don't all agree, but feel the room is not safe enough for them to object. So now I perceive that everyone is in agreement with me. The curse of knowledge, and what that is as soon as you know something, you assume everyone else knows the same thing. So for example, we did not achieve our objective because of the hyperconvertive Port Madalou Epinaut event. No one knows what that event was, but we assume that because we understood what it was and how it impacted, everyone else does. So often things blow through a performance meeting and we don't understand it, but we don't raise our hand. Availability heuristic. Or I should embellish that. And that is, when I said that it was the event that caused it, I wasn't trying to confuse people. I wasn't putting a mask on it. I just assumed everyone else understood what it was as I did. And so it's all done with great innocence, but because of the team dynamics, it's not surfaced. Availability heuristic, which is when we rely on examples, the first thing that comes to mind. So what we've heard repeatedly is we didn't hit our target because of COVID. Well, many times when we hear that excuse, we go, COVID didn't cause that problem, but it's the first thing that came to mind because 99% of operational issues we've seen recently, one way or the other, root back to COVID. Naive realism, where we believe we observe with, objectivity, whereas the rest of the world is biased. So what's that look like? Well, in that case, the objective's poor performance was because of the sales team. And if you're objecting with me, it's just you think they can't do anything wrong. So I'm perceiving that you're biased and I'm looking at the problem based on the raw facts and objectivity. The Dunning-Kruger effect, which is, when you don't know much, you're confident. But when you begin to know more, you get less confident. What's that look like? I'm certain we'll have no other problems with this objective this quarter, right? I really don't know that, and therefore I seem to be pretty confident. On the other hand, if I knew there are 18 things that were stacking up, I'm going to get less confident about any conclusion. Anchoring. When we make a decision, we rely heavily on the first piece of information that's presented to us. What's that look like? We achieved our objective because X happened. Well, that may or may not be the case, but that's the first piece of data that I'm presented with, and I grab onto that. Confirmation bias, one of my favorite, which is we tend to remember information that confirms our perception. So we filter. What's that Simon and Garfunkel song? A man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. So, example would be we always outsell our competition because of our pricing. Well, that's the first piece of data. We'd like to think that pricing makes a difference, but have we actually validated that? Backfire effect, what I call the boomerang effect, where our beliefs can be confirmed by disproving evidence. So what's that look like? We own most of this market. And that's proven because our competition's publishing data that says the opposite. In other words, they're publishing fake data, which confirms that ours is correct. Bias, belief bias. And that's where the strength of an argument determines how plausible it is to us. So, for example, we agree that our competitor is publishing fake data, even though we have little data to prove it. So, it sounds plausible, and therefore we accept it. Status quo bias, which is we tend to believe things that allow things to stay the same, and any changes from that baseline are a problem. So, we're going to keep our direct sales team. We would lose too much if we went online. So, maybe online has more opportunity for us, but that's a change and we just prefer things to remain the same. So, you know what, we'll keep that direct sales team. The sunk cost issue, which we've seen a million times everywhere, I'm sure. Even when we face negative results, we continue to invest in something rather than change. Something like, we've invested too much money in this custom programming so that now we don't want to buy a packaged solution. In other words, there's a sunk cost. I keep putting in a small amount of this customer programming to solve the next issue, and the technological gap is getting bigger and bigger. But because we've already invested in this thing, I don't want to invest in a packaged solution. Gambler's fallacy, which we think that our future possibilities are biased by previous ones. If you roll the dice a dozen times, you never get a pair of sixes. You think the next time is a higher probability of getting sixes, which of course it isn't. In the business world, what does that look like? We say, well, our last 3 products failed, and we know that 1 in 4 succeed. Therefore, this next one's sure to succeed. Zero risk bias. That's where we prefer to reduce risk to zero, even if we could do something else that reduces overall risks to a greater extent. So, for example, maybe we should enforce our non-compete clause. That's going to reduce, people going to our competition to zero. But there's a better way to reduce overall risk, which is, have more engaged employees or something like that. Framing effect, where we end up drawing conclusions based on how information is presented. So, for example, if I said we've got an incredible 5% increase in this objective, that sounds very positive. But I could have said the same thing. We only achieved a 5% increase in this objective. Now it seems like that was a negative thing, that I only achieved 5%. So based on how it's presented or framed, I come to different conclusions. The authority bias, which is just that, we tend to believe authority figures. So something like, our CEO said that this performance was acceptable. So then even if it's not acceptable, because it came from the boss, we acquiesce. Survivorship, right? We tend to focus on where we succeeded and we forget where we failed. So for example, and I've heard this one a gazillion times, our strategy is great because Google did the same thing. And I ignore the fact that 10 other companies went bankrupt because they tried doing it and they failed. Law of triviality, which is we disproportionately weight trivial issues. I've been in meetings where they spend 2 hours talking about the parking lot and 20 minutes talking about, the $8 million investment in a new printing press. So an example would be spending 30 minutes debating, a little tiny 5-minute issue and not having time left over in the meeting to discuss that bigger 40-minute issue. Now, this is also known as Parkinson's law. And that law says the time spent on any item will be the inverse to the proportion of the sum of money involved. So the less money, the more time you spend debating it. And probably it's because we can get our brain around it better. The bigger, more expensive things, they're complicated problems, and we tend to dodge those. The IKEA effect, which is, the meme is ownership builds commitment. Things that, we created seem to have a higher personal value. So, the marketing campaign we created is better than the one we would have had if we'd contracted out to some marketing company. And so, again, that's sort of that pride of authorship thing. Bystander effect, which is, that we're less likely to chip in if there's a whole bunch of other people around. What that looks like is often in performance meetings, each one of us has something to add in, but no one's speaking up, and therefore no one begins that conversation. Once one chips in, then more chip in, and away we go. But often everyone's standing there waiting for someone else to come up with some ideas. When no one does, we figure that for some reason it's unsafe and don't do so. Clustering illusion, where we try to draw a conclusion through random data. So, in this example, our objective's performance is directly related to the moon phase on odd number months. Like, that's just random data. You made that up. But, we can kind of draw a pattern, and therefore we think it's a reasonable conclusion. And we often see that clustering illusion in OKR performance meetings. The blind spot bias, which is individually, even though we don't think we're biased, we see the bias in other people. So what that looks like is, my team is performing well against our objective. You just don't want to see it, right? So we don't think we're having that blind spot, and we think that you're biased. Optimism bias, where, glass is half full. What that looks like is, despite this month's performance, we're certain we're going to achieve this objective. Or the inverse, right? The glass is half empty. We overestimate the likelihood of bad outcomes. So this case example would be, no matter what we do, we're not going to fail on this objective. So technological debt, which is, we keep on making incremental investments in the wrong areas. So, we cut some corners in this product's development. Now we have to pay 10 times as much to fix it in the field. So, and that technological debt gets bigger and bigger, right? If I wait another month, maybe it's 11 times as much to fix it in the field. Wait another month, now it's 12 times as much. So we end up building more and more debt. But in the OKR meeting, I don't want to speak up about it because I know if I go in a particular direction, I'm incurring that 10 times expense. Loss aversion bias, where we tend to favor options that reduce losses over those which increase gains. What does that look like? An example would be, we can cut costs by laying off our sales team. Well, that reduces our losses, but we're not looking at what we could do to increase gains. Like maybe we should actually be hiring more salespeople, and that's going to overcome it by increasing our gains. Ambiguity bias, where we prefer options which we can guess what the outcome is going to be versus those where we cannot. So that's, let's get people back into the office because I can better predict what that does, as opposed to trying to figure out how we can make work from home succeed, because I don't really know what that's going to look like and what benefits it's going to give. So I'm more likely to work towards getting people in the office because I can predict what that means, as opposed to work from home. And then finally, the availability bias, which is just basically because it seems familiar, right? This objective worked because it's just like buying a car. Well, it's an adjacent thing. Buying a car has a bunch of steps on it, and this objective has the same steps on it. Therefore, it's like buying a car. That parable doesn't necessarily work, but we use that kind of framework anyways. So again, these are what we commonly see in performance meetings. You're going to see a mix of these, and your organization is going to bias towards some more than others. But this gives you a good rundown of what you can experience inside the meeting. And if you're aware of these, we actually had one client that made these up as sort of a game of cards. And when we saw a particular bias coming up, we would play that card just so that we would track the biases. And over time, they played less and less cards in any meeting because they're all becoming more and more aware of these biases and managed to filter them out of the meetings to make the meetings more productive.